In my previous video, I discussed the situation in the fighting in Ukraine, at least in Donbass, to be precise, in Soledar and Bakhmut, and I said that as of the time of making of that video, there was little evidence of a Ukrainian retreat from Soledar, despite claims made the previous day that it looked as if the Ukrainians were indeed preparing to withdraw from Soledar, with some suggestions that the withdrawal from Soledar would take place over the course of the following night. Well, as events would have it, by the time my video was published, news started to trickle through that Soledar had in fact been captured by the troops of the Wagner organization, and that most, though perhaps not all, Ukrainian troops who had previously been defending Soledar did indeed pull out of the town just before it fell. Now, I would say that it does seem that some fighting is still going on in Soledar. The head of the Wagner organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who has been very visible over the last couple of weeks and who has had his photograph taken in one of the salt mines in Soledar, which have just been captured, surrounded by troops from the Wagner organization. Anyway, Prigozhin has said that though the Wagner organization now fully controls the entire metropolitan area, if you like, of Soledar, there are some Ukrainian holdouts, and he spoke about a cauldron, in other words, a encirclement, a tight encirclement of some Ukrainian troops in the center of the town. Now, other reports, all originating from Russian sources, put the number of troops, Ukrainian troops, who are still in Soledar, holding out, trying to push the Russians back, or perhaps not push back the Russians, but rather to hold on to their positions in this central area of Soledar, and who are trapped there. Russian reports claim that there are around 300 to 500 of them, which is, by the way, a significant number. It doesn't seem, however, despite whatever fighting is still going in Soledar, that there is any real doubt any longer about the outcome of the battle there. It's clear that Soledar has fallen, or is in the process of falling, that the Russians are now in effective control of Soledar and will be in total control of Soledar within the next couple of days. That seems to me to be the logical position. And there have been also some rather distressing film, apparently taken by Ukrainian soldiers who've retreated from Soledar, showing the circumstances of their retreat. I'm not going to discuss that in any further detail. Now, I have discussed many times in many videos my bewilderment, my inability to understand the reason why Ukrainian troops have been holding on in places like Soledar and Bakhmut for as long as they have been, given the fact that the loss of these two places, Soledar and Bakhmut, it seems to me, is only a matter of time. And in fact, there are reports today, lots of reports today, lots of commentaries today on telegraph channels, both Russian and Ukrainian, to the effect that the loss of Soledar makes the position of the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut untenable, and that Bakhmut itself will probably fall fairly quickly. And there's also been some rumors, well, I'm not sure that they're rumors, but there's been all kinds of claims circulating about the penetration of Russian forces into Bakhmut itself from the northwest, and the implication appears to be northeast, and the implication appears to be that the village, the important village of Krasnaya Gora, through which supplies reach Bakhmut from the north, and which sits astride the main road from Bakhmut to Siversk, the town at the northern end of the so-called Zelensky line, the defense line the Ukrainians have created in Donbass. Well, if these reports about Russian troops operating inside Bakhmut are correct, then it seems likely that this village has been taken as well, in which case that northern road has also been cut. Now, I want to stress this isn't something I know. It's not even something I exactly infer. I say that based on these reports. I haven't seen a single report that actually says clearly that this village has indeed been captured. And it may be that it hasn't been, and it may be that I'm muddling up the facts and I'm not understanding what these reports say. But again, I can't help but think that with the fall of Soledar, the fall of this village, if it hasn't already happened, is now only a matter of time. So, quite possibly, it looks as if Bakhmut also, the position of Ukrainian troops, is becoming untenable. And yet, we see the same pattern with that we've seen in Soledar. Ukraine, instead of withdrawing its troops from Bakhmut in good order, appears determined to go on fighting in Bakhmut right to the very bitter end, with the result that we're going to see, no doubt, the same terrible defeat that we saw in Soledar. In fact, there is a report today, I'm not going to say it's a report, call it, if you prefer, a rumor, that General Zaluzhny has had another of his difficult meetings with President Zelensky, in which apparently General Zaluzhny is supposed to have told President Zelensky that the position of the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut is now impossible and that they should be withdrawn immediately in order to avoid their total entrapment, but that President Zelensky has rejected this advice and has again insisted that the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut must hold their ground. Now, I want to stress again, I don't put very much credence in these stories about discussions between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, but I pass it on because it's not an entirely implausible story, and it may be that something like that has indeed happened. Anyway, many people have come up with all kinds of explanations about why Ukraine fights so bitterly to the very end to hold on to every millimeter of ground that it can, despite the impossibly high cost that this causes. And interestingly, in CNN, there's been now a report from a Ukrainian soldier who's been fighting in Bakhmut, and in Soledar specifically in Soledar, and he's told CNN about some of the things that have been happening in Soledar. And I'm going to read out an extract from what this Ukrainian soldier has been saying. As I said, this is reported by CNN, and it's been widely circulated, but I still think it's interesting. And CNN says, this is to say the soldier, described a dynamic battlefield where buildings, this is in Soledar, where buildings change hands daily and units can't keep track of the escalating death toll. Note the last words. Units can't keep track of the escalating death toll. No one will tell you how many dead and wounded there are because no one knows for sure. Not a single person, he said. Not at the headquarters, not anywhere. Positions are being taken and retaken constantly. What was our house today becomes Wagner's the next day. In Soledar, no one counts the dead. Now, of course, you could say that he's talking about both Ukrainians and Russians, Wagner assault troops. But let me say again, what he knows is about what is happening to the Ukrainian troops. Whatever he may think he knows about the kind of casualties the Russians are suffering is probably mostly a guess. So he admits that Ukrainian troops in Soledar have been suffering impossibly high losses and that no one counts the dead. And he goes on to say the Ukrainians, this is the CNN article now, says the Ukrainians have lost many troops in Soledar, but the ranks are being replenished as the fight for the mining town continues. And then we have the same soldier again. Says the personnel of our units have been renewed by almost half, more or less. We do not even have time to memorize each other's call signs when new personnel arrives. And then comes the killer paragraph. The soldier said that he believed Ukraine's military leaders would eventually pull out of Soledar and questioned why they hadn't done this yet. Everyone understands that the city will be abandoned. Everyone understands this. I just want to understand what the point is in that case of our fighting house to house. Why die if we are going to leave anyway, today or tomorrow? So that's a Ukrainian soldier. He cannot understand why he and his comrades are being made to sacrifice themselves to this extent in order to defend a place, Soledar, which is going to be lost anyway. And this has been the repeated pattern throughout the fighting in Ukraine, especially, I should say, in Donbass. Now, as I said, many people have come up with explanations. Some people say that the Ukrainian government is callous about its people, that it wants the war to continue as long as possible. I can understand that. Others say that the optics of withdrawal are very bad and would go down badly in the West, and that might affect calculations about Western aid. Still others, more generously, claim that Ukraine is fighting these bitter battles in order to gain time. Though time for what? I've never been able to understand, but we'll come to that later. Anyway, I understand all of these explanations. I can see the force, if you like, of some of these explanations. But ultimately, it seems to me that on any human calculus, and I accept I'm introducing into this a degree of humanity, or which some people would say doesn't really apply. But anyway, on any human calculation, I simply cannot understand the logic of fighting to the death to defend a place that is going to be lost anyway. Or, worse still, ordering people to fight to the death for a place that eventually is going to be abandoned. Anyway, that's all I get to say about this. I've made this point many times. I don't want to repeat it further. I've just, however, quoted what a Ukrainian soldier who's fought in Soledar thinks about all of this. And I'm going to now say a few further things about problems which may arise on the Russian side. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who undoubtedly leads the Wagner organization, he's its erstwhile founder and creator, whilst touring Soledar with his men, has gone out of his way to talk about the fact that only Wagner troops carried out the successful assault on Soledar. Now, I suspect that factually that is true, in the sense that I suspect that the fighting over the last few days, the storming of the town, has been carried out exclusively by Wagner troops. However, I doubt that it is the full story, and I noticed that early today, the Russian Defense Ministry pointedly said that Russian paratroopers have been operating in the north and northwest and eastern areas of Soledar, preventing the escape of Ukrainian troops, blocking the Ukrainian troops who have been trying to escape from that direction. Now that seems to me a not so subtle way of telling Prigozhin, well, actually, you may say that you took Soledar all by yourself with your Wagner troops, but we were involved, whatever you may be trying to claim. Our troops did participate, even if only in a supportive capacity. And by the way, I've seen Ukrainian reports which have been making exactly the same point, that irrespective of what Prigozhin says, Russian paratroopers have undoubtedly participated in an important supportive role in this battle. Well, why does this matter? It's become fairly clear to me that Prigozhin is now trying to leverage the success of the Wagner organization and its fighters in the battles in Donbass in order to stake out some important role for himself in the future. I may be a bit cynical here in saying all of this, but I find it difficult to explain in any other way his sudden extraordinary visibility over the last few weeks, his appearance, for example, in this salt mine in Soledar, the photos that have been taken of him there. He's obviously wanted to be seen with his men right at the moment of victory. And inevitably, this is going to provoke some opposition to him from some quarters. And I think his attempt to seize all the credit for the victory in Soledar for himself and for his organization is already provoking some response, as we've seen from this pointed bulletin from the Russian Defense Ministry saying, well, just to help, our paratroopers were there, even if they didn't actually storm Soledar itself. But it's also the case that a soldier, an important person, has now been promoted to a senior position in Moscow, and he has no reason to be, shall we say, fond of Prigozhin. And this person is General Alexander Lapin, one of the two Russian commanders who participated in the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The other one, by the way, was none other than General Surovikin. And Lapin will, I suspect, nurse something of a grievance about the way in which Ramzan Kadyrov and Prigozhin ganged up against him after the fall of Krasny Liman and implied that it was in some way General Lapin's fault, something which the soldiers on the ground, by the way, mostly dispute. Now, I don't think Lapin cares very much about what Kadyrov says, because Kadyrov is known to be a hot-headed personality, and he sometimes speaks his mind and does so emotionally. But I suspect that he feels very differently about Prigozhin and the much more calculated way in which Prigozhin seemed to side publicly with Kadyrov against himself. Now, why does that matter? It matters because General Lapin, who apparently offered to resign, but had his resignation refused, has now just been appointed by the Russian Defense Ministry Chief of Staff of the Russian Ground Forces. In other words, he's been appointed to a more senior position in Moscow. And, well, whether this will cause tensions in the conduct of the military operations between the command in Moscow and Prigozhin, I have no idea. But anyway, regardless of that, it does mean that Prigozhin really does need, in my opinion, to be a bit more careful about some of the things he says in future if he doesn't want to make more enemies than friends. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. I think it's an interesting twist, and it does, by the way, this whole episode does, by the way, show that Lapin still has supporters, powerful supporters, within the military leadership in Moscow. Now, where do we go from here? Now, I agree with those who take the view that it is now only a question of time before Bakhmut falls. In fact, I have no doubt about this. There's been all sorts of claims over the past couple of weeks, claims which I've reported on this channel, that Bakhmut and Soledar are strategically key locations, that they sit astride the various communications lines of the Ukrainian troops in Donbass, and that the Ukrainian positions in northern Donbass especially are likely to collapse once Bakhmut and Soledar falls. And it does seem to me that the position of the Ukrainian forces in Siversk is now beginning to look extremely precarious with the fall of Soledar. And to my inexpert eyes, it does also further seem that once Siversk falls under Russian control, which I'm sure before long it will, that the entire Ukrainian position along the Kharkov-Lugansk border, in places like Liman and Kupiansk and Izium and all of those sort of places, that the Ukrainian position there begins to look extremely vulnerable, and any idea of advancing from these positions into Lugansk region, that's beginning to look much less likely. Now, I've already discussed that. I also believe that the fall of Bakhmut is going to make Ukrainian positions opposite Donetsk city far more precarious than they have been up to now. Again, this is my own inexpert view. I'm not a military person, but it does seem to me difficult to see how, given Bakhmut's position, how the Ukrainians are going to be able to hold on to their positions in Avdiivka and other places there for very much longer once Bakhmut falls. And in fact, we're getting more reports of continued fighting in this area of around Avdiivka in Donetsk region, near Donetsk city. Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, says that there are still Ukrainian troops holding out in some of the suburbs of Marinka, that they are gradually being pushed out. And he went on to say that once Marinka falls, Krasnogorovka will also fall, and that's where most of the shelling against Donetsk is coming from. And of course, the Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka will also become very vulnerable. And I have to say, if Bakhmut falls soon, then I suspect that entire process that Pushilin is talking about will accelerate. But does it mean the total collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Donbass? Well, I've seen on various places that the Ukrainians now appear to be trying hurriedly to create a new defense line from Konstantinovka through Kramatorsk to Slavyansk in the north. This will be the last Ukrainian defense line in Donbass. Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are important cities, towns in Donbass, as by the way is Konstantinovka. And if Ukraine loses these three places, if this latest defense line is broken, then, to say it straightforwardly, Ukraine has lost Donbass. So the Ukrainians have been thrown back to their last defense line. Now, over the last few weeks, as the Western media has, and the Ukrainians themselves have cast doubt on the strategic importance of Bakhmut and Soledar, we've been receiving all kinds of reports about the fact that Ukrainian defense lines west of Bakhmut are much stronger than in Bakhmut itself, and that this line, Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, is going to be much more solid than the Bakhmut Soledar defense. Well, we will no doubt find out whether or not that is true over the next few weeks and perhaps months. I'm going to express my own personal opinion, which is that I think that is most unlikely, and I think that pushback to Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, the Ukrainians are going to have much more difficulty holding their positions, if for no other reason than because there is no system of communications which can be easily protected and controlled behind this line. I say that because I'm repeatedly told, I'm dependent on what others say, that there are very few built-up areas behind this line of towns, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, all the way to the Dnieper River, to the town of Dnipro. So up to now, the Ukrainians have been able to send troops and supplies up the roads to Kramatorsk principally and other places, and across basically open land. But once they've arrived at Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinovka, they've had the benefit, if you like, of urban cover, and this has made it easier for them to send their supplies to the front lines in Bakhmut, Soledar and such places. Now, the roads leading to Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka are going to be within the range of Russian artillery, not just long-range artillery, but shorter-range artillery, and the whole process of supply is going to become more complicated. That's one reason, amongst many, why I think this is going to be a more difficult line to hold. It's probably also psychologically, I'm speculating now, psychologically harder for soldiers to defend the last defense line than it is to hold a forward defense line, having the knowledge that behind them there are further defenses that they can fall back to. Anyway, I'm not going to speculate too far. This isn't my thing, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But anyway, a notable victory by the Russians nonetheless. And here I'm going to make a further point, which, by the way, has also been made by various other people in various places, which is, of course, that this is a battle, the Battle of Soledar, which the Russians had to fight to win. The same was true about the battle in Mariupol, and the same was true at the battles of Popasnaya and of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. The Russians have had to fight the Ukrainians to achieve victory. Now, this contrasts with the Ukrainian capture of places like Izium, Kupiansk, and Kherson. Now, Ukraine didn't have to fight these sort of battles against the Russians in order to capture these places. The reason was that on every single instance, the Russians pulled out for one reason or another. I'm not going to go into details as to why they did that. I've discussed that at extraordinary length in previous videos, but the fact remains that these were places that the Ukrainians occupied rather than had to fight bitter battles to capture. And this brings me to a further point about this war, which is that this is a point which many Westerners perhaps many Western commentators are very reluctant to acknowledge, which is when actual fiercely fought battles take place, it is the Russians who win them, not the Ukrainians. If we go back to the fighting in Kherson region, for example, when the Russians fought the Ukrainians in Kherson region, west of the Dnieper, in nearly all of the encounter battles, I can only remember one in which the Ukrainians gained the advantage. In all of the others, it was the Russians successfully held the Ukrainians off whilst inflicting upon them very heavy casualties. So it's the Russians who tend to win these battles, not the Ukrainians. And the other big question is, who is losing more winning these battles? Is it the Russians or is it the Ukrainians? Well, I have no doubt at all it is the Ukrainians. And there's, by the way, just been an incredibly sad public letter published by a Ukrainian policewoman in the region of Volhynia in western Ukraine, who talks about the enormous losses that the people of that region have had to bear over the course of this war. I'm not going to read out this letter. I find it too distressing to do, and of course, it's one person's public letter. But there it is. If you want to locate it, I don't suppose it'll be too difficult. It does give a harrowing picture of the effect of the war on these small communities in this part of western Ukraine. So I know nothing comparable in any part of Russia. And that leads me to the view that, as I said, when the Russians give figures for Ukrainian casualties, well, maybe they exaggerate them from time to time. I'm becoming, like many people, very skeptical about that claim they made a few days ago that they killed 600 Ukrainian soldiers in a missile strike. I've seen no evidence that that is the case, and I'm beginning to doubt that story. But I have no doubt that overall, the Russians are inflicting much heavier casualties on the Ukrainians than they are suffering as a result of things that the Ukrainians are doing to them. And that, I think, explains why also the Western powers are now hurriedly trying to cobble together weapon systems, tanks, armoured vehicles and the rest to send to Ukraine. Now, my colleague Alex Christoforou, in a recent programme that he did on his channel, made the absolutely valid point. If Ukraine is winning the war, as so many people in the West insist, if Ukraine has captured so many weapons, tanks and armoured vehicles from the Russians, if, as has actually been claimed, Ukraine actually has more tanks than it started the war with because of all the trophy tanks it has captured from the Russians, why in that case does it need tanks? And yet that is what Ukraine is doing. It is going from place to place, from Western governments begging for armoured vehicles and now especially for tanks. For Abrams tanks, for Leopard tanks, for Leclerc tanks, for Challenger 2 tanks. I've discussed all this in earlier videos. Now, unsurprisingly perhaps, this has resulted in all sorts of people in the West who, my impression is, are very supportive of Ukraine, coming up and making, pleading that Ukraine should be provided with these tanks. And there's a good article, there's a good example of this, an article in The Guardian by a gentleman called Frank Ledwidge, and he speaks about the need for the Western powers to clarify exactly what their objectives in Ukraine are. Is it to bleed the Russians to death? Is it to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression, or is it intended to enable Ukraine to achieve victory? Now, Mr. Lubridge doesn't say which of these options he supports, though I have no doubt at all from the content of his article that he's one of those who wants Ukraine to achieve victory. Victory being the return of the whole of Donbass and of Crimea back to Ukraine. And he makes this very interesting point. This is how he expresses it. Until now, the weaponry transferred to Ukraine has not included significant amounts of the kind of heavy equipment that will allow Ukraine to retake its land. The key capability here, as requested by Ukraine's military command, are US-made tanks, armoured fighting vehicles, and a step change in the amount of artillery. We are talking here of hundreds, not tens. Earlier this month, the US announced the transfer of 50 Bradley armoured fighting vehicles. The Ukrainians asked for up to 700. What has been given was sufficient for the Ukrainians to challenge Russia's ground forces and to defend its airspace. That last I don't really see the evidence of, but anyway. But it is insufficient for Ukraine to conduct large-scale maneuver warfare to retake increasingly well-defended Russian-held provinces. And the continued occupation of these provinces, by the way, constitutes Russia's clear primary war aim. Well, this is an interesting article, and as I said, I've seen many of them all over the Western media recently. You know, the Ukrainians need tanks because without tanks they can't advance, so we've got to provide them with tanks so that they can advance. Fundamental problem, and the point which I've noticed that none of these articles that I've been reading, and Lubridge's article is no exception, they never seem to recognize is that at the start of this war, Ukraine had hundreds of tanks. It's not as if they didn't have hundreds of tanks before. When they started the war, they had probably more tanks than most Western NATO countries, except the United States. They inherited a huge arsenal of tanks from the Soviet military. Now, most of these were heavily updated afterwards with Western help. And as I said, Ukraine had large numbers of tanks, large numbers of armoured vehicles. And then over the course of the fighting in the spring and early summer, the Russians burnt through all of those. But then, of course, in the summer, the West started to supply more tanks. Now, these were not Western tanks. They were Soviet-era tanks, also refurbished, with new computers and guidance systems and all that sort of thing from countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, wherever. And these were again supplied in hundreds to Ukraine, along with infantry fighting vehicles and, of course, guns. And again, the Russians burnt through all of those. Now, why is it assumed that if Ukraine is now supplied with Western tanks, Leopards, Challenger 2s, Abrams, Leclerc, why do people assume that Ukraine will be more successful using these tanks than they were when they had hundreds of tanks, either of their own or provided to them from former Warsaw Pact armories? Well, I know that there are lots of people who are going to come back and say, well, Western tanks are vastly superior to Russian tanks and Soviet-era tanks, and one isn't really comparing validly one with the other. I know people who would take strong issue with that. I've met somebody who's worked with both types of tanks, both Western and Russian. He comes from a global south country, I'm not going to say which, and this person is clearly of the view that Russian tanks are at least as good, even though they are designed in a different way. But the point is, tanks are vulnerable, they can be destroyed, with the Russians having huge preponderance in artillery, which is not going to change as far as I can see, and having air dominance, which isn't going to change either as far as I can see. It seems to me that Ukraine, if it's given Western tanks and armoured vehicles, is going to burn through them just as it burnt through all the other tanks and armoured vehicles that it had in the past. There has been a consistent pattern throughout this war of assuming that Western weapon systems, if provided to Ukraine, are going to be game changers. It was said about the HIMARS system, it was said about the M777 howitzers, it was said about the Caesar howitzers and the M109 self-propelled howitzers supplied by various countries. Said about the HARM missiles, it was said about the Javelins, about the Stingers, about very high-speed British air defence missiles. Nothing like that has ever proved to be true. Every time these weapon systems are provided to Ukraine, they have a certain effect at the beginning, then the Russians adjust to their presence and are able successfully to counter them. And I'm convinced that with tanks, it's not going to be any different. And I have already discussed why I personally think that large numbers of Western tanks and armoured vehicles supplied to Ukraine are not really suitable for this kind of battlefield and this sort of landscape. Again, I don't want to repeat myself, but these tanks are big and heavy, as are the armoured vehicles, the Bradleys and the Marders and the British Warriors, if they're supplied as well. And they're extremely difficult to maintain and to keep operating in battlefield conditions. They're much more prone to mechanical breakdown, as any big, heavy vehicle is. And to be straightforward about this, tanks, armoured vehicles supplied from many different countries is going to create a logistical nightmare at a time when Ukraine's logistics are already under severe stress anyway. So I don't think this is going to be anything like the game changer that people think, and I certainly don't think it is going to be the solution to Ukraine's problems. Brian Beletic at the New Atlas discusses all this sort of thing much better and more clearly than I do, but I just want to repeat my own thoughts, if only in order to make clear my agreement with what he says. But again, also we come back to the question of quantity. Britain is talking about supplying 10 Challenger 2 tanks. Huge, complex machines, difficult to operate, difficult to train on, effective, no doubt, in certain situations, but probably not suitable for Ukraine. 10 of them in a war where tanks are counted in the hundreds is more a burden. It's going to be more of a burden than an asset. At least that is my view. And, well, perhaps from various different sources, the West can scrounge together the 300 tanks Ukraine says it needs. But is this really going to be anywhere near enough for Ukraine to execute the kind of offences that it is talking about? And will it in fact even get that many tanks? The Americans seem to be determined and being absolutely clear they're not going to supply Ukraine with Abrams tanks, and I suspect that they're going to stick to that position. Leopard 2s, possibly, probably. Leclerc's, very likely. Challenger 2s, well, the 10 of them undoubtedly, eventually. though I doubt that they will do Ukraine much good. But anyway, a couple of hundred tanks is not going to change the course of the war. Now, I wonder whether this is something that people in the West understand. If they do understand it, then it gives rise to a rather troubling thought, which is that we might now be in a situation where tanks and armored vehicles are being provided to Ukraine, not because Western leaders any longer seriously believe that Ukraine is going to achieve victory. They must, after all, be well aware of the enormous build-up of Russian forces in eastern Ukraine and in Belarus, and of the enormously strong defenses that the Russians have been creating in parts of eastern Ukraine, or what was eastern Ukraine. I wonder whether these supplies aren't really more intended as token gestures, intended to give the impression that the West is really supporting Ukraine, even as some people in the West are starting to think about tiptoeing away from what looks like increasingly a debacle. Well, if that is the calculation, then I should say I think it's a very cynical one, but it's the kind of thing that governments do, and it wouldn't entirely surprise me. Anyway, I just wanted to make this observation about the fact that, as I said, people who advocate for the supply of Western tanks to Ukraine seem oblivious to the fact that Ukraine started the war with hundreds of tanks and has had at various times of the war hundreds of tanks. And they talk as if Ukraine is going to be suddenly provided with a capability which it never had, when that is demonstrably not true. Now, I'm going to finish this video with one final point. Now, in recent speeches, President Putin and the secretary of his President Putin's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, have both talked about a Western plan to fragment Russia, to break Russia up into multiple parts. Well, predictably, when people like President Putin and Mr. Patrushev make these kind of statements, you see all sorts of people coming forward and saying, well, they're being paranoid. This is hysterical, fear-mongering language. Nobody in the West entertains any such ideas or hopes or plans. Nothing like that is real. And that's what you read in lots of places. The word paranoia is one that is often invoked when discussing Putin and other Russian leaders and their opinions of what the West's intentions are. Well, it may be paranoid. It may be that the Western leaders really have no plans to break up Russia, but a whole chain of information really points to why the Russians might think otherwise. A couple of months ago, there was, as I remember, I think in Washington, a conference, I believe it was organized by the RAND organization, but I might be wrong, about the need to decolonize Russia, in other words, to break it up and to create all kinds of ethnic republics on its huge territory. And that, as it turns out, is not an isolated case, because a few days ago, there were reports circulating that the Atlantic Council has done a survey of various experts on Russia, and they're all predicting, or most of them are predicting, that within 10 years' time, Russia will either have become a failed state or will have broken up. So, you're getting reports from the Atlantic Council like that. And then in the Financial Times, just the other day, there was an interesting article, yesterday in fact, from a person called Mr. Casey Michel, somebody, by the way, who comes with an extremely impressive biography, which says that misfiring war in Ukraine creates potential for Russia's disintegration. And then he goes on to say fraught legacies of colonization are returning to haunt a multinational state founded as an empire. And then there is an extraordinary account of Russian history, which I'm not going to read this article, an extraordinary account of Russian history, which I have to say I don't recognize as having very much relation to the actual Russian history, but never mind that. But anyway, it talks about Russia having been created through a brutal process of imperialism and colonization, similar to that which the Western powers undertook when they founded their colonial empires, and that, like all empires, Russia perhaps is ripe for disintegration, and that this war in Ukraine is likely to lead to that outcome. I would say, in fairness to Mr. Michel, that he doesn't say that this is a prediction, but reading his article, which of course, as I said, the Financial Times has published, I can't help but think that this is his desire. Now, Russian leaders, of course, read these articles, and they must be seeing how much coverage, the fact that they've been published in places like the Financial Times. And I have to say, given the circulation of articles like this, I can't help but wonder whether their fears that the disintegration of their country are part of the West's plans, whether those fears are indeed as misplaced as some people in the West from time to time claim. Now, on the topic of Russia's disintegration, I'm going to say straight away that two things. Firstly, the people who seem to will it seem blind or unaware of the fact that Russians are a substantial majority in every region and republic that makes up the Russian Federation, with the exception of Chechnya. So if Russia is going to be broken up in this way, what we're going to see is an extraordinary division of the Russian people, or else their expulsion from places which have been their long-standing home. That's the first thing to say. The second is that Mr. Michel and people who advocate this seem to be completely oblivious to the dangers of breaking up a nuclear superpower, or of the enormously strong likelihood that if a process of fragmentation like this were indeed to take place, that this huge territory that is today Russia would inevitably draw in the competition of the other great powers, the West and China. So I have to say, this is not an outcome which it seems to me any sane person of goodwill would want to see. To me, frankly, it looks like a nightmare, an inhumane nightmare, and I'm sure most Russians would think the way I do. I'm sure they will act to prevent it from ever happening. But it is disturbing to me that there are people in the West who think like that, and I have to also say that the very fact that there are people in the West who think like that explains Russian concerns. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say today. No doubt we'll be getting a lot more news about the state of the battlefields within the next couple of hours. So wait for my next video and I'll give you an update as to what is happening on the battlefronts and where this particular battle is going. But the Battle of Soledar itself does now look as if it is essentially ended, even if, as some people rather crudely put it, there is still some mopping up to do. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find us on multiple platforms, including Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. Links under this video. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Also, you can go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing merchandise that we make or that we supply, that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all of those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to check your subscription and to tick the like button. Thank you very much for joining me again, and more from me soon.